Hello and welcome back. This is the Week 11 lecture. So today we continue our brief tour of literary criticism. We've already covered several popular and common critical approaches. Remember, we started with formalism and reader response criticism, and then last week we moved on to structuralism and post-structuralism, two notoriously difficult approaches, but I think we covered them sufficiently. So now this week we're moving on to feminism and gender studies. So this is another popular approach. It became increasingly popular towards the end of the 20th century. But one thing I do want to talk about today, and I want to sort of issue a disclaimer before we get started, because feminism and gender studies are certainly political approaches to literary criticism. They are more political ways to read, analyze, and interpret literature. So that does make some people uncomfortable, and that's okay. But the important thing to remember is we can take bits and pieces of a political approach and use it to study literature, to say interesting things about literature, even if we don't necessarily subscribe to that overall political worldview. So obviously it's okay if we do subscribe to the politics endorsed by a particular critical approach. If we feel aligned with those politics, then that makes the work a little bit easier. But even if we don't feel totally aligned with the political position that's being sort of expressed or represented through the critical approach, that's okay. We can still use parts of that critical approach without necessarily subscribing to that overall political position. So I want to reiterate that next week as well, once we move into a little bit of Marxism, a little bit of materialism, and also post-colonialism and new historicism, because those are all pretty political approaches. But we can use them even if we don't agree with all of the politics. So again, feminism is a pretty controversial topic currently, I think, in our society. Certainly a lot of people, both male and female, identify as feminists, and other people don't. So I want to be clear that I'm not advocating for a particular political viewpoint here. You guys don't have to subscribe to all of these ideas. You're certainly free to have your own opinions, your own beliefs. This is not a political science class. I don't really like to talk about politics explicitly in this class. So let's just keep that in mind. And as we cover the critical approach this week, and then the critical approaches that we're looking at next week, let's make an effort. I would like to make an effort to sort of separate ourselves a little bit from sort of mainstream American politics, which is a little bit difficult, and it might even sound a little contradictory because I've just said these are political approaches to literature, so we can't totally divorce ourselves from politics. But I want us to remember that when we're talking about politics, we're still focused on literature. We're still relating or using political positions to help us better understand, interpret, analyze literature. So our focus remains kind of narrow. We're not really going to get involved in the politics of Washington, D.C., Republican versus Democrat. That's not really the way we are going to use politics. We're going to talk about politics for the next couple of weeks, but we're still relating all of these ideas to the study of literature specifically, which is a slightly different application than what we might see on the nightly news or what's being argued online. And I think we'll observe that, right? If we're sticking to literature, then some of these terms and some of these, theories and critical approaches operate a little bit differently within the realm of literature compared to how they might function out in the real world. So let's just keep that in mind. So feminism is one of those terms that gets debated a lot because people don't always agree on a basic definition for this term. As we probably know, a lot of people use this term in different ways. Different people use it in different ways, and there isn't always a clear consensus on what we mean when we say feminism or when a person identifies as a feminist. So I just want to stick with the dictionary definition to begin with, because that's largely what we're going to work with this week. But we can make a few adjustments perhaps as we go. But the most broad, basic definition of the term is this. It's a broad set of movements, beliefs, ideologies that are all designed to establish equality between the sexes. So let me just say that again. Feminism can be defined very broadly as a large set or collection of beliefs, movements, and ideologies, so like belief systems, that are designed to advocate for equality between the sexes. Now, there are different kinds of equalities, and we can talk a little bit more about some of these. So we could mention legal equality, like equal rights under the law, okay? And we know a little bit about that. We can also talk about economic equality, and that's a concept or a term that's increasingly being discussed nowadays. How do we make sure that, all Americans have equal access to economic opportunity? And again, some people kind of reject that way of thinking, and they say there's really no reason for us to concern ourselves about economic equality. And then other people think that economic inequality is actually a pretty big problem in this country. And for what it's worth, whether you think it's a big problem or not, income inequality, which is sort of a part of economic equality, income inequality is increasing in America, and it has been increasing over the last few decades. So there is a bigger gap in this country now between people who have a lot of money and people who might not have nearly as much. And that gap is widening. I mean, we have pretty clear evidence to that effect. Social scientists have, done a lot of research that show that the inequality gap, income inequality gap, is growing. Which is, an interesting thing to consider. Some people feel like those are just all based on personal choices and it's just up to an individual to do well economically. But we should also remember that in this country, we believe in economic equality to a certain extent. That is kind of a founding belief, even though we haven't maybe always lived up to it. The idea of upward mobility, the idea that anyone in this country can make it economically, regardless of how much money your family has or who you are, where you come from. If you work hard, make good decisions, you can be financially or economically successful. That's kind of a big part of the American dream. It's kind of a big part of our American values. So we can talk a little bit more about economic equality. We could also talk about social equality, just, talking about like social roles, how people function in society. And then finally, cultural equality. This is an important concept for us as well, because we're talking primarily here about like cultural productions, like literature, like movies, like TV, and other art forms or other forms of media that are sort of out there and being consumed by people on a daily basis. Music would be another example. These are all expressions of culture. So we can talk about cultural equality, like who gets to create a lot of this culture, who gets to create art, who gets to, create best-selling novels or popular movies. And we'll notice that things are changing in the cultural arena. But certainly, if we go back in time, if we go back to previous historical eras, a lot of art, a lot of culture was created by men and often sort of written about and evaluated by men. But we can notice some changes in that department if we sort of look at the modern day. So we can talk about all four of those levels of equality: legal, economic, social, and cultural. So one big thing that feminism, that the feminist critical approach really does, and again, we almost have to distinguish between feminism just in general as it works in the world versus the feminist critical approach in literature. We can get a little bit more specific about how we are using feminism, but feminism in general, just as this big group of ideas and movements and beliefs, it often does call attention to the mistreatment of women or the oppression of women, the inequalities that women have historically been subjected to in the Western world and really throughout much of the world. But our focus in this class has kind of been on Western culture because that's what we know best in the US. So we're talking about like Western Europe and of course the Western Hemisphere where we are. So kind of looking back through history, examining some of the ways that women have historically been marginalized, silenced, sort of held down by a patriarchal society, a patriarchal culture. So I do want to say a quick word about patriarchy because this is another word that gets contested and debated a lot, and people kind of use the word in different ways, and there are some disagreements about what exactly the word means. So again, if we're just talking about a dictionary definition, a patriarchy is, or a patriarchal culture is simply a culture organized for men, largely by men. So in other words, a society or a culture that's largely controlled or run by men. And there is some, ongoing debate about whether or not we live in a patriarchy right now in America. Maybe there's a debate about whether or not we have historically lived in a patriarchy. And again, you can have your own views, you can have your own opinions, but just keep in mind that when we talk about a patriarchy being sort of created by men, largely for men, that doesn't mean that only men participate in it. And this is sort of a sticking point for a lot of people. This is a source of confusion for some people. But keep in mind that women participate in patriarchies. They have to, right? Just as a matter of logic and numbers. Because if you're thinking about numerical, if you're thinking about the demographics, numbers, right? There are more women in existence on the earth than men. Then there's I think a slight numerical advantage for women in the US, and there usually is. There's slightly more women than men just in terms of sheer numbers. So with that being the case, obviously patriarchies are sometimes supported by women. Women might play roles within a patriarchy. And scholars and critics will sometimes say women, and in many cases women might be consciously, deliberately, intentionally participating in a patriarchy because they support it, they think it's right, they agree with it for various reasons, whether those reasons be religious in nature or those are just cultural, social beliefs that they have. So sometimes their participation in the patriarchy is deliberate and conscious, but then other times women might unconsciously participate in the patriarchy. They might do it without necessarily meaning to do it. They might do it just out of habit. A lot of historians and scholars will tell us that the patriarchy is so ingrained in most of us because we've always lived in it. We just sort of look at it as normal oftentimes. We don't always think about it very much or question it. So both men and women are often sort of buying into certain aspects of patriarchal culture, whether that be cultural values about like how people should look or how people should dress, or ideas about social roles, the differences between male and female social roles. A lot of times this stuff shows up in relationship dynamics. How men and women function in relationships, how they function at work, who's often in positions of authority. All of that stuff kind of falls under, these types of questions. So, again, you don't necessarily have to think that we are in a patriarchal society, but a lot of people do feel that way. And certainly historically, a strong argument can be made that our society has largely been organized and led by men. I mean, if you just think about the fact that we've never had a female president of the U.S., historically, most of our lawmakers, most of our politicians have been men. Most of our CEOs, the people in charge of our biggest companies have historically been men. And then if we turn to culture, if we turn to things like literature and other forms of art, again, historically, traditionally, a lot of the most famous writers, a lot of the most famous and well-respected movie directors have been men. Now, again, that's true historically, and most people would agree that that has been true historically for most of our history, but things are perhaps beginning to change now, where we are starting to see more representation, more women attaining positions of power, whether it be politics, the business world, or the cultural sort of art and entertainment world. So we can track some of these changes, and we can observe some gains that maybe we have made as a country, as a society, but this is still kind of an ongoing project, perhaps. So yeah, that's just a little note on the patriarchy and just the way we should sort of think about it. Again, we might argue that it's kind of going away, or that the power of the patriarchy is diminishing. But historically, it seems largely like a fact, not just here in the U.S., but again, going back to, Western European countries, going back to previous eras, the people in power were typically men. But of course, there are matriarchal societies in the world. There's not as many of them. But if you go to places like Papua New Guinea or places in Africa, different cultures in some other parts of the world subscribe to more of a matriarchal model where women have sort of, more leadership roles within those societies. But typically in the Western world, we haven't seen that as much. But again, maybe things are changing. But another thing to keep in mind about feminism and how it's changing now, and how this critical approach is changing a little bit in our modern day, is that it's really getting a lot more multiple and diverse. And that's a big part of modern day contemporary feminism, also called third wave feminism. So we're going to talk a little bit about the different waves, the different historical movements that we can track going back really all the way to the 19th century, because there's a long history here that we need to at least be somewhat aware of. But the third wave is the wave that we're in right now. So contemporary feminists are often concerned about sort of expanding the scope of feminism, sort of looking at different kinds of feminism. So a popular sort of phrase that circulates sometimes is that we don't just have one feminism anymore. Now we have multiple, we have plural feminisms. Because there's not just one perspective, there's not just one angle, there are many different perspectives. And historically, a lot of the leaders of the early feminist movements were largely middle-class, heterosexual white women. So their perspective was kind of dominant during the earlier waves of feminism, and now in the present day, there has been a concerted effort to expand, to sort of try to incorporate other non-white, non-hetero perspectives. So we have a sort of, just more seats at the table, a broader sense of representation. And also feminism is just really important if we're just strictly within the context of literary criticism, because it helped to pave the way for future critical approaches like ethnic studies, queer theory, and even post-colonial studies, which we'll be talking about next week. Also, gender studies, which we'll be talking about a little bit more today. So it really helped to sort of create some space for future approaches that are doing similar things, trying to expand representation, looking at literature from a more diverse, varied set of perspectives. So feminism helps to pave the way for a lot of that. But a lot of what it paves the way for is often labeled as identity politics, or the use of identity politics in the study of literature. And identity politics is another one of these terms, like feminism, like the patriarchy, that not everybody likes. Not everybody likes these terms. Not everybody necessarily agrees with the usage of these terms. But again, we're trying to separate ourselves a little bit from all of the, political infighting in Washington. So we're more interested in identity politics in a broad sense, just thinking about different kinds of identities. And some people think maybe there's too much emphasis on that in certain areas of life, certain, walks of life. But again, our focus remains on literature. And within our realm, within our particular context, identity politics tend to be viewed as a pretty good thing when it comes to literature, the reading, the interpretation of literature. Having more people at the table, having more perspectives sort of accounted for or represented is usually looked at as good. These are just giving us more ways of reading. More people's perspectives usually results in a sort of richer, more diverse field of potential analysis and interpretations. So we're creating more opportunities for more kinds of people who historically have been excluded or silenced. The LGBTQ community, non-white people, various minority groups. Again, people who didn't fall in that white, middle-class, heterosexual mold that a lot of the early feminists sort of represented or embodied. We're now giving a lot more of those people a chance to have their voices heard. And not only that, but there's also more opportunities for these different groups to produce literature of their own and to conduct analysis and interpretation of their own based on their own life experiences, based on their own priorities, their own beliefs and values. And again, it's fine if not everybody agrees with the ideas they're expressing or the work that they're doing, but we're just opening up more opportunities. That just means more possibilities, like I said, for analysis and interpretation. And in the world of literary studies, that's usually viewed as a good thing. But in other areas of life, it might be viewed a little bit differently. But let's try to confine ourselves to the study of literature. And one more note before we get into a brief history lesson, just to kind of keep this in mind as you're maybe comparing this approach to what we've learned over the previous couple of weeks. So a lot of people will say that feminism and post-colonialism and gender studies and some of these more recent critical approaches are political commitments more than they are true methods for reading literature. And that's kind of up for debate. I don't think we have to necessarily view that belief or claim as the gospel or, indisputably true, but a lot of people do feel that way. They make a contrast between something like formalism and a critical approach like feminism. And they would say, formalism is literally a method of analysis. It's a way to identify certain features or elements of literature. And it's really sort of a guide for the kind of interpretive work that we need to do. And some would say, well, feminism's a little bit different than that. It's a political commitment that can be carried out through writing literature or interpreting literature, but it's not giving you it's not giving the individual reader or the individual student the same kinds of specific tools necessary for identifying irony, for example, or imagery, or talking about metaphors. It's more of a political orientation that can help to sort of get you engaged with the text, or it can give you a particular purpose or a particular angle to take with the text. But it's not giving you that kind of detailed step-by-step instructions, for actually examining specific elements or specific features the way formalism or even reader response sometimes gives us. But we talked a little bit about this with structuralism too. Like, structuralism differs from formalism in the sense that it's not necessarily a great tool for interpreting the meaning of literature, but it does give you a chance to analyze language more. And you can think more about words and the relationship between signifiers and the signified. And you can do a lot of cool work with that, but it's not going to be as helpful, perhaps, for interpretation. So all of these critical approaches have different strengths, and then they sort of have different blind spots. But other people would say, no, actually, feminism does give you an opportunity to jump into specific features, to grab hold of specific elements, because again, you have a particular lens. You're looking for specific things for specific reasons. So I think all of these critical approaches are equally helpful as long as we keep in mind that we're still hunting for all of those literary devices and elements that we've been talking about throughout the semester, all the key characteristics of fiction, poetry, and drama that we've already been talking about. All of these critical approaches can help us find and talk about those elements. They just help us do it in different ways. But again, this is more political than what we've been talking about previously. The formalists didn't want to talk about politics at all because they did not want to get outside the text. The only real political engagement or commitment that the reader response people had was that readers matter, okay, stop devaluing the reader. And then structuralists and post-structuralists, they're more interested in linguistics and philosophy than sort of contemporary politics, although the post-structuralists, the deconstructionists who were kind of making things tricky and showing us that language is very unstable and meanings change, they did engage a little bit with politics, but we haven't really seen the kind of political commitment that we get here with the feminist approach. And again, post-colonialism is similar. There's usually a particular political perspective or a political sort of priority that can be carried out through writing and interpreting literature. So that does make them a little bit different from some of the other approaches. Okay, so we don't have to be experts on the history of feminism, but we should know a little bit just so we can appreciate the third wave and how it differs from some of the previous waves. So typically when we sort of outline the history, we start with the first wave of feminism, which in America really goes back to our founding. It really goes back to the late 18th century into the early 19th century, and it continues throughout the 19th century. And the first wave was really focused on women just fighting for basic legal rights, mostly focused on legal equality. So remember those four types of equalities that we mentioned: legal, economic, social, and cultural. They were first focused on legal equality, literally fighting for the right to vote, which of course women in this country did not have until the year 1920, only 100 years ago. So many first wave feminists were social reformers in kind of a broader sense. So they were fighting for equal legal rights for women, while they were also fighting for things like the abolition of slavery. at least up until the 1860s when the Civil War came along and slavery was abolished. So they were engaged in other social causes. Many of them were also invested in labor reforms, trying to institute more humane labor laws, things like preventing children from having to work, or people, trying to standardize like an 8-hour workday so people weren't being literally worked to death in some of these factories and these other types of sort of unforgiving workplace settings. So they were engaged in a lot of different social issues. So largely in the U.S., we think of this movement as really getting underway, like truly picking up steam, like in the middle of the 19th century, like in the 1840s, 1850s, and then really culminating in 1920. And again, their crowning achievement is women gaining the right to vote in the year 1920. So that's kind of the end of the first wave. The first wave's kind of crowning achievement is the passage of the 20th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote a century ago. And then we have a little bit of a lull, we have a little bit of a down period until World War II in the 1940s. And after World War II concludes, we really have the birth of the second wave of feminism. And the second wave really hits its stride in the 1960s, around the middle of the 20th century. And there were a couple of really important texts published around that time that helped to sort of spark the second wave and really sort of crystallize it as a distinctive movement. So first we have Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, which was published in 1963. I've actually posted a brief excerpt from that in the Week 11 module. You guys can check it out if you want. That's a very famous text. It's sort of trying to make sense of the disillusionment and disappointment that a lot of suburban, sort of middle-class white women who were often mothers and wives, the sort of discontentment that they were increasingly feeling over the course of the 50s and 60s. They were often confined to these very specific roles. So we'll notice that now we're looking a little bit more at cultural and social equality, maybe even economic equality. A lot of women did not work during the middle of the 20th century. The man was the breadwinner. The woman traditionally would stay at home, take care of the house, take care of young children. And again, everybody's different. Plenty of women were fine doing that, but there was an increasingly large segment of sort of middle-class suburban women who were just dissatisfied and maybe rejecting certain aspects of their social roles. And of course, they had very limited economic power. They didn't really have money of their own. They kind of relied on their husband when it came to matters of money. And there's kind of the old saying that a lot of women went straight from their parents' house to their husband's house. They never really had independence. They never really had a chance to do a lot of things for themselves. And that's what Friedan's writing about in the early 1960s. And then later, another famous book by an author named Kate Millett, who does a lot for feminist film studies as well, if we're interested in that. Millett writes a book in 1970 called Sexual Politics. So again, we're starting to think more about women's social roles. Yes, they had achieved a certain amount of legal equality, although gaining the right to vote does not necessarily equal legal equality in all respects. But they do have a say, obviously, in choosing our political leaders. But by the middle of the 20th century, there's more of a focus on cultural and social equality. And a lot of women are dissatisfied with their relatively narrow, confined social roles. And you got to keep in mind, a lot of this does have to do with World War II. So a lot of you may have learned about this in a history class. During the war, obviously a lot of American men went overseas to fight in Europe or the Pacific and were gone in many cases for a number of years. So in order for the U.S. economy to continue to kind of hum along, and in order for us to create all the weapons and other wartime necessities that we needed, a lot of women had to go to work during the war years. A lot of women would go and perform, in some cases, the types of jobs that men would have historically done, like working in factories, like working in shipyards, doing hard physical labor that previously would have been thought sort of unacceptable for women to do. But because the men were gone, the women had some of these opportunities to work, to earn money of their own, and to sort of show themselves to be physically capable of doing the work. So a lot of you have seen that famous wartime poster of Rosie the Riveter, who's saying, "We can do it." That's an example of a lot of the women who had to go back to work doing what would have been considered traditionally masculine jobs. So there was a thought, at least briefly, that because women were doing that during the war years and often doing it with great success, that after the war ended, there'd be maybe expanded opportunities for women, that they might be thought of a little bit differently. They would have more chances to work and maybe earn a living for themselves. But that didn't really happen the way a lot of people expected it to happen. After the war ended, the men came home. Of course, the ones who survived, they came home, often went to college on the GI Bill, and then got married, started families. And then, of course, those men would often embark on successful careers, and the women would be at home. So in other words, things went back to how they had been before the war. And that sense of disillusionment, a lot of women thinking that things might change and then realizing that things really weren't changing that much, there was some disappointment. And that got expressed in some of these texts during the 60s and 70s. And just as a point of comparison, something very similar was happening in terms of race relations, and we're going to talk more about that next week. But a lot of African Americans went and fought in World War II as well. Our armed services, I think, were still segregated then, but a lot of African Americans did fight, and then they came home sort of hoping and thinking that things might be a little bit different for them too, because they had just gone and risked their lives for their country. And a lot of African American servicemen who were in Europe and countries like France and England, they noticed that racial hierarchies were a little bit more lenient in some of these European countries compared to how things were in the US with Jim Crow laws. So a lot of African Americans came home and they said, it's very disappointing that I'm still treated like a second-class citizen in the country that I just went and risked my life for. I was actually treated better in France, or I was treated better in these various European places than I am back at home. So the disillusionment was not only felt by women, it was also felt by African Americans and other racial minorities who did not get increased opportunities or increased equality right after the war, despite what they had done for the war effort. So that's going on around the middle of the century. And again, we kind of return to our racist ways, our misogynistic ways to some extent, and a lot of women were dissatisfied. And again, they were more focused on cultural equality, social equality, whereas the first wave was almost exclusively focused on legal equality. Also, around the middle of the century, we have the 20th century, we have the development of some other kind of subgenres of feminism. Some other types start to emerge during the second wave era. So we have what's called cultural feminism, obviously focused on cultural equality, but also kind of interested as a movement, interested in what a women's culture might look like. Again, they're subscribing to the idea that traditionally U.S. culture, popular culture, whatever, has been sort of governed by men, largely created by men, and of course consumed by men and women. But a lot of the writers, a lot of the tastemakers, a lot of the critics, a lot of the early literary critics who helped to pioneer approaches like formalism, like structuralism, like post-structuralism, were all men, at least initially. So, kind of an awareness that a lot of the culture that we're all familiar with has largely been shaped by men. So, kind of wondering, hey, what would it look like if women had the power to create their own culture? So that's cultural feminism. And then also difference feminism. Now, this is a little bit controversial. Not everybody who identifies as a feminist necessarily subscribes to difference feminism. But it is something that kind of increased in visibility and popularity during this time. So with this kind of subgenre, we're not just focused on equality, although that's still a big part of it, but we're also acknowledging the importance and the distinctiveness of women, and how women are distinct from men in many different and interesting and important ways. So they were still fighting for legal rights. They were still fighting for more protections against sex-based discrimination and harassment, but they're increasingly concerned with culture and cultural productions. So that's part of where we see feminism going around the middle of the 20th century. And then after the second wave kind of plays out, we have the third wave of feminism, which is the wave that we're still kind of currently in the midst of. And this is often thought to really begin in earnest during the 1990s. So at the end of the 20th century. And in many ways, it is defined, the third wave is defined or categorized largely based on some of the ways where it sort of challenged or opposed the second wave, challenging certain assumptions or beliefs of the second wave. So like I've already said, in the third wave, we're very interested and concerned with opening up feminism to more people, more perspectives, more experiences, not confining it just to white middle-class women. And frankly, throughout the first wave and throughout the second wave, feminism was largely guided by white women, largely heterosexual white women who originated from the middle classes. That was Friedan's background, that was Millet's background, that was the background of the first wave leaders. So now we're starting to open things up. And we're creating more seats at the table, like we were saying earlier. But another thing that the third wave was kind of about was often rejecting this notion of an essential, sort of universal female identity that was shared by most women on the planet. That was endorsed and sort of supported by a lot of second wave feminists. And third wave feminists often reject it. And they're sort of influenced here a little bit by post-structuralism and deconstructionism, which kind of tells us that, you know, there isn't a whole lot of essential inherent stuff that remains the same, that remains true forever. Because language changes, culture changes, and none of this stuff is really stable and eternal. So the idea of an essential female identity that can be tracked amongst all these different women across all this, you know, all these different centuries or different points in time seemed very unrealistic or implausible to a lot of third wave feminists. So again, they're interested in expansion and not trying to fit everybody into one category of essential female identity. So now we're more interested in hearing from women of color, more interested in hearing from women who are part of the LGBTQ community or lower class women who don't have that middle class background, the experiences of immigrant communities. Because again, all of these groups are constantly changing or growing. And if we sort of buy into that post-structuralist belief that nothing really stays the same, and language does not stay the same, and there are lots of different meanings. Remember, that's another important belief that the third wave kind of picked up on from post-structuralism, this idea that there isn't one meaning, right? Language never just delivers one single meaning. That's what the formalists thought. And remember, those formalists were mostly older white guys. They thought, hey, if you read the text the right way, you're going to arrive at the one true interpretation. But later, post-structuralists said that's not true. Language can have limitless possible meanings. It just depends on what you're doing, how you're reading it, and also who you are. And again, reader response people would have agreed with that point, right? Your own identity, your own sort of background, your own beliefs, your own values are always going to affect the way you read literature. Those things are always going to affect the way you analyze and interpret. So again, I know some people reject identity politics and they don't want to talk about it, but when we're talking about the analysis and interpretation of literature, I don't know how we can really escape from identity. Our own personal identities are always tied in with the analysis and the interpretation that we conduct. That's just a part of it. We're always bringing our own experiences, our own personalities to bear when we do this kind of work. So again, it's just impossible to avoid when we're talking about the study of literature. So another thing that the third wave does is they kind of scrutinize and challenge a lot of the things that we had maybe typically taken for granted when it comes to gender relations and sort of differences between men and women. They challenge a lot of binaries. So again, they're not super on board a lot of times with that difference brand of feminism, which is really focused on how women are different, distinctive, all to themselves, because a lot of the third wavers challenge these basic binaries that divide male versus female, or, gay versus straight, black versus white, first world versus third world. If we think of America as like a first world country compared to third world countries, they're rejecting a lot of those binaries and they're saying, they're just made up. Again, this is a little similar to what we heard with post-structuralism. They're taking some of those findings from the structuralists and pointing out, hey, a lot of the rules that we follow with language, they're just made up, right? The whole relationship between signifier and signified, we just made that up, right? We could sub out one word for another, and as long as we all agreed to learn the new word, it all works just as well. There's nothing stable. There's nothing natural about any of this. We just constructed it. We built it for our own convenience, but it also traps us. That's what the post-structuralists said. They said the way we treat language, the way we want language to mean just one thing, that's very limiting. That's almost like putting ourselves in a box and we can't get outside of it because we're so narrow and confined. Well, that's kind of what the third wavers are saying about a lot of these traditional ideas about gender roles and these traditional binaries that separate these things that are supposed to be very different or even opposite from one another. They're saying that's all just made up, right? Those are just constructs, social constructs, and they might have some value and some meaning. We don't have to always dismiss them entirely, but we need to see them for what they are. They're not set in stone. They're not natural laws that, have existed forever. They're things that our patriarchal society has created over time. And we can challenge them, we can change them, and if they're not working for some of us, we can hopefully break free from them. So they're very keen on defining feminism individually rather than buying into some kind of larger collective definition that includes all women. So again, they're kind of rejecting the idea of an essential feminine identity. They're saying we don't really believe in that. This idea that there's sort of an essentialist group of feminist traits and features. Instead, they claim that a lot of what we think of when it comes to gender is constructed, which means it's not set in stone and it can be changed. These are things that have been constructed or built throughout history in our society. So let's just keep that in mind. That really helps to give rise to gender studies. That helps to give rise to this idea that gender categories, at least what we think of as gender categories, are often cultural, not biological. They're not natural. They're created or made by our culture, by our society. So we can maybe adjust them, we can change them, they can evolve perhaps over time. But before we get into gender studies, I kind of skipped over this, but I want to go back to it because it might be a helpful way for us to actually apply this approach to our own work. So Elaine Showalter was a feminist critic from a while back, and she identified what she called the 3 phases of literary development, of women's literary development. So we might want to use some of these ideas ourselves if we want to use the feminist approach later. So her first phase is what she called the feminine phase, which was back in the 19th century, like from the 1840s up until the end of the 19th century. And she says during that phase, women were mostly just kind of imitating men. Like women wanted the same things that men had. So they wanted the same rights, they wanted the same privileges, and when they wrote literature, because of course women have been writing literature just as long as men have, going back even to ancient societies, but when women were writing literature, because they had less power, because they had less representation, they were often trying to imitate the popular male writers of the time. And that's kind of the first phase, as they were first starting out on this feminist journey. And then the second phase, identified by Showalter, is what she calls the feminist phase. And that really begins at the turn of the 20th century, and it goes all the way up until the 1920s, when they do finally gain the right to vote. And she's saying this phase is really focused on fighting for rights, sort of fighting against the oppression that they suffered at the hands of men, and just, again, trying to gain certain kinds of equality. And then the third phase is what she calls the female phase, and that starts in the 1920s and kind of has gone on ever since. So whereas previously women were either imitating men, particularly in writing, or maybe using writing oftentimes to advocate for equality in the legal and political realms, after the 1920s, when we move into the female phase, they're often focused on uncovering misogyny in older texts, and also sort of rediscovering women's texts and rediscovering important women authors. So again, that sort of impulse to find oppression or find misogyny, that kind of dates back a little bit more to the second phase, where they're kind of fighting and they're facing this uphill struggle. There is carryover, but they're mostly focused, by the time we get to the final phase, the female phase, it's more about rediscovering the importance that women, the important roles that women have played in literature, in artistic and cultural productions, and sort of bringing a lot of these often forgotten or neglected women writers more to the forefront. So that's really what the third phase is about. The second phase is more about seeing how misogyny and oppression against women has worked historically throughout time, but they kind of move away from that by the third phase, and it's more about championing and sort of celebrating the important roles that women have already performed, and just, again, they might not have been given the attention or the space that they deserved previously. So, and actually I see this in the study of American literature, which is my field, and I teach classes in American literature, and a couple of writers that we often talk about at the very beginning of our semesters in these classes will be Anne Bradstreet and Phyllis Wheatley. And a lot of Americans don't know who those writers are, but Bradstreet is arguably the first writer of literature in our history. She was writing in the 1600s in colonial Massachusetts, and she actually had a volume of her poetry published in the year 1650. And as far as we can tell, as far as literary historians can tell, that's the first work of literature ever published by somebody living in America. Now, of course, Bradstreet would have identified as English. She was born in England. She came over early on during the colonization of Massachusetts. She came over to, Plymouth Rock and all that kind of stuff. She was kind of a part of what we think of colloquially as pilgrims. But she's maybe our first writer, our first kind of homegrown writer, because she did spend most of her life, at least her adult life, in Massachusetts. And then Phyllis Wheatley is probably our first African-American writer of literature. She was born into slavery in Boston in the late 18th century, but she was a prodigy. And as a teenager, she was producing like classically influenced poetry. She actually was given the opportunity to learn how to read and write. A lot of slaves didn't have that chance, but she became very proficient in the language, and she wrote really sophisticated poetry, and that was published during her lifetime. She died young, but it was so novel to people during that time to think that an African-American woman could produce sophisticated literature that the leaders in Massachusetts actually forced her to prove that she was writing her own poetry, that they didn't really believe that somebody like her could produce poetry. So she actually had to go in front of this like council or tribunal and prove that she had this mastery of the language. And she was like asked to recite poetry and recite some of her own poetry. And of course she was able to do it, and she showed her knowledge, and people were shocked because it went against the prejudiced notions that so many people had during that time. So that's kind of what we mean. That's what Showalter means when she talks about this final phase where we're just kind of rediscovering the important roles that women writers have always played in American literature and American culture more generally. So, bringing Bradstreet and Wheatley into the conversation. Traditionally, early American literature revolved mostly around male writers. But now we put them alongside the men and say they're equally important. Their contributions are just as valuable. So let's study everybody. Another thing that Showalter does, and again, this is rejected by a lot of third wavers, but she has what she calls the 4 models of difference used by sort of more traditional feminists. And we could use any one of these models if we want to. If we find any of these useful, we can apply them to our own work. But again, we don't necessarily have to believe in all of these models of difference, but I'll just run through them quickly. The first model is biological difference, basic biological differences between men and women. The second model is linguistics. So she's claiming that women often use language in ways that are different than the way men use them. So we have differences in bodies, which I think most people would agree there are some differences there, and then differences in language, the way language is used. And then the third model is sort of psychological differences in our psyches, differences in certain like mental or psychological processes, and then finally cultural difference. And again, we might be able to see some of these still operating in society today. Different social roles, different social contexts affecting race, class, nationality, and obviously gender as well. So just men and women functioning differently within culture, having different roles to play, maybe having different levels of importance or value placed on them within what many people might think of as a patriarchal culture or society. So we can reject those four models of difference, or we can use some of them. we can use some of them when we are reading and analyzing literature. But again, some of these notions about difference are largely rejected by the third waivers. Again, they're sort of re-examining, or at least, kind of interrogating our notions of difference and these different binaries that separate male and female, masculine and feminine. And they're, again, not necessarily saying that none of these differences exist. Again, at least some of them do exist in at least certain contexts. But the larger point that a lot of third waivers would make, like I've said, is that these differences are constructed. They were created by our society. They are not natural in the world. So we might be able to transcend them or at least change them in certain ways. And again, they often think of gender roles as being constructed, man-made. They are cultural, perhaps not always biological. So that is our transition to gender studies, which we can just kind of cover briefly here at the end, because this is another one of these more contemporary critical approaches that was made possible by the rise of the feminist approach. So gender studies is basically just an approach, again, to culture, but also to cultural productions, and that includes literature. And this approach tells us that, again, gender is socially constructed, not a natural biological thing. So we can distinguish here between sex and gender. And that might be necessary or important for us to do. So we might think of sex, differences in sex, as being biological. And again, those sort of biological differences that we can observe between the male and female body. But then we can think of gender as being separate from sex. And that's what gender studies often encourages us to do. We can think about gender as being more about the social roles that get assigned to men and women in our society, in our culture. Rather than physical differences. Because, we can't really deny the physical differences, but we often conflate sex and gender, and we might sometimes think of them as the same thing, or so closely connected that you can't separate one from the other. And a lot of gender theorists or people using the gender studies critical approach would say, no, sex is biological, but gender is socially constructed. And gender is really all about social roles. What men are supposed to do, what men are supposed to be like, versus what women are supposed to do and what women are supposed to be like. So that's more of their focus. So they're very interested in sort of breaking down and examining some of these so-called differences between masculine and feminine. Again, between gay and straight, because they would say these distinctions are made by culture. These distinctions are sort of taught and they're handed down from one generation to the next, but they're not necessarily always true. They don't maybe apply to all people. And there are ways to maybe rethink them, or at least just explore them and kind of see how they work. And maybe we can also see some limitations and some problems with some of these binaries or some of these traditional social roles. So again, they're often rejecting a lot of sort of traditional Western standards when it comes to sex and gender. A lot of feminist critics in the current moment, in the present moment, are looking to sort of rediscover, like feminist critics, a lot of people working within gender studies are trying to rediscover LGBTQ voices from previous eras of literature, or they're looking to explore non-binary characters or non-binary perspectives. Again, sort of looking, we can always look for that stuff in earlier eras And there's been a lot of good work done in that sort of in that mold. Critics and scholars going back to older text and finding characters that might be coded as LGBTQ, or they might be sort of representative of a different kind of identity, and maybe a non-binary or a non-traditional gender identity, but because of the time period, they can't be open about it. Either the character can't be or the author can't be, so everything's kind of kept beneath the surface. It's kind of implied but not openly talked about, because of course that's how those kinds of things were handled for a long time. So you can always go back to older texts and sort of find examples of that, but we can also champion current LGBTQ writers or current non-binary perspectives that are increasingly getting opportunities and exposure today. So we can kind of go in either direction, both with the feminist approach and the gender studies approach. Again, like Showalter was saying, we can go back and find oppression of women in older texts, or we can focus on women writers, women characters, stuff that might be happening right now, but also the important roles they've played in the past. So the same is true for gender studies. We can go back and discover older oppression. We can go back and find LGBTQ voices before they were given an equal platform. And we can look at what's happening in our contemporary moment and certain gains or changes that might be occurring right now. So we're very interested in continuing to create new opportunities here. With gender studies, we're interested in creating new opportunities to represent all of these different communities through the production of new texts, and also through sort of different ways of analyzing and interpreting texts by using these kinds of lenses, these kinds of beliefs and ideas. So we can go back to Shakespeare. We can go back to Walt Whitman, who was at the very least bisexual. Maybe he identified as a gay man. We don't really know. But again, when Whitman was writing, a very famous American poet, when he was writing in the 1800s, his identity wasn't really something that he was going to talk about openly, but it shows up in his literature. It shows up in his poetry in interesting ways. So we can go back and discover that. A lot of gender study critics or feminist critics can find these kinds of characters or these kinds of themes in works by Shakespeare and other older literature. So again, this is a way to revisit old stuff and approach new stuff. And it just gives us things to look for. It gives us a particular political or social angle or lens that we can use. Just another tool in our tool belts. And just a final note, again, there's a lot of affinity, there's a lot of connections between post-structuralism and third-wave feminism and gender studies. Because again, third-wave feminism and gender studies are kind of influenced by certain ideas that got circulated by the post-structuralists. Ideas that there is no unified text. Meanings are always multiple. Meanings are always changing. And that might also be true about certain gender identities and certain social constructs connected to gender. Okay, that's enough for this week. You have your final alternative media due at the end of this week, so this is our chance to actually take one of these critical approaches and apply it to texts that we're reading and examining right now. So that's your final alternative media. After that's complete, we can wrap up our tour of literary criticism, and then we'll get ready for our next critical response. So get in touch with me if you have questions, and I will see you next week.